All right. So I'm going to talk about home brewing, specifically beer, and what it is and should I try it. Message up front, it's a waste of time and resources and you should not do it. So if you want to leave now, that's pretty much the whole presentation. I don't really have a disclaimer because I do consider myself an expert and I do want you to take my advice in this situation. Ultimately, just saving you a lot of time and money. So yeah, let's get into it as soon as. Okay, so you're gonna start a new hobby. The first thing you wanna ask, is it even legal? Is it legal for me to brew my own beer in my house? That's a really great question. You definitely don't wanna be breaking the law if you're gonna be home brewing. So before we can answer that question, we really have to look into what is the purpose of law and the legal system. You know, Aaron Burr postulated that law is whatever is boldly asserted and plausibly maintained. But in order to determine what laws are, we have to consider the ethics behind them, and are those ethics substantiated? And in order to answer that question, I like to turn to my man, Immanuel Kant. And he had this thing called the categorical imperative. So this is a really good framework. There's lots of different moral decision-making frameworks out of there. A lot of them are kind of confusing. This one especially. Some of them are too basic, but I think this one will answer our questions adequately. And it's divided into 4 parts. So the first part is act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can, at the same time, will that it become universal law. So you say, I want to make beer. Would it be okay if I want to do that, if everyone could do that? I would say yes. I think that if you want to make beer, you probably wouldn't have too much a problem with anyone else doing it on their own, unless for some reason you were trying to profit massively through like a monopoly or something. So I'd say it passes number 1. Number 2, recast that maxim as the universal law of nature governing all rational agents, and so as holding that all must, by natural law, act as yourself propose to act in these circumstances. Kind of related to the first one. Hey, is it okay if everyone does this? Is it universally okay if all people who have agency, or all beings that have agency, which in this case is people who are part of society, also make their own beer or homebrew? Passes. Part 3, consider whether your maxim is even conceivable in a world governed by this law of nature. I think it's very conceivable that everyone could brew their own beer at their house, so passes number 3. And lastly, ask yourself whether you would or could rationally will to act on your maxim in such a world. If you could, then your action is morally permissible. So you would be willing to not only have the desire to brew your own beer, but also to actually do it and get the supplies necessary and take all the steps to make it happen. Therefore, I would say it also passes number 4. So back to the question, is it even legal? Irrelevant, because we have moral and ethical justification to do it. So who cares what the law says? If there's a law against it, it is probably not in accordance with the will of society and therefore should be abolished. But just so you feel better, yes, it is legal in all 50 states to brew your own beer. Since 1978, there is no limit on the amount that you can produce. So you can produce hundreds and hundreds of gallons of beer as long as it is for your personal use, which brings us to this last section here. Can I sell it to other people? No, that's the part that's illegal. So if you want to actually sell the beer that you're making to other people, you have to obtain a federal brewer's bond, and then a state license, and finally a local license to sell alcohol in whatever city or county that you live in. So there's lots of bureaucratic red tape. A lot of this has to do with just barriers of entry into the industry, because alcohol is a very desirable product. You can't just have everyone making their own and selling it, because that would just flood the market. And I guess for a lot of moral reasons, they instituted all these different laws and licenses in order to sell it. Also, there is like a factor of human health safety. Hey, are the facilities clean that you're using? Is the product that you're producing actually safe for people to consume? So that's also a little bit of it. However, there are lots of exceptions and workarounds to this kind of issue. You may have seen it if you've been to some breweries where maybe, or even restaurants. I can recall one specific restaurant in Texas where they made their own homebrew without a liquor license or a brewer's bond. And what they did is they sold a commemorative cup. And so you bought the cup, and when you bought the cup, they would fill it with the beer that they made there for free. You might have seen that if you've ever visited a brewery with like friends or something, where the beer is free, but you have to pay like $7 to go on a tour, and that includes like a glass and 3 free beers. Or maybe it's just free altogether, like Allagash Brewery, but then they also have their cans and everything on the side that you can purchase. So that kind of depends on the local regulations and what kind of license that particular facility holds. But for you as a personal individual, you cannot sell it to other people without first going through all of those legal hoops to get authorization to do so. So some common misconceptions about homebrewing I'd like to address up front. One of the biggest ones that people have asked is, all right, filtered versus unfiltered beer. So if you make a homebrew beer, one of the questions you'll get is your beer filtered? And the answer is categorically no. There's not really any reason to filter beer. The reason that you would filter a beer is if you'd added some kind of strange constituent to it in the brewing process. So maybe you added like a whole bunch of fruit or a bunch of coffee that you then had to remove. Another reason to filter beer is if you're like a large production facility like Budweiser or Miller, and you are trying to extract the most amount of sugars out of the materials that you use. If you filter your beer after it's been produced, you can then kind of reuse some of that grain that didn't have the yeast consume its sugars in your next batch. So there's a couple reasons why you'd filter it, but as far as home brewing, there's not really any reason for you to do that. It'll come out clean and clear with minimal yeast, even without some kind of advanced filtering that, whether it be through like some kind of carbon filter or whatever it may be. Fruit beers. So one of the things that people want to do when they first start brewing is like, oh, I want to make all these cool like fruit beers, cherry beer, orange beer that, I've had at Harpoon Brewery or something like that. This is a very bad idea. Don't do this. So fruit beers have a huge propensity to cause an explosive process in your fermentation. Not particularly dangerous unless your face is right by the lid of your fermentation container when it goes off, but it makes a huge mess. And this is just due to the sheer amount of sugar in fruit. The yeast really like that. They're made to consume that type of sugar, so they very much do so very efficiently, and it ends up ruining the beer pretty quickly. Another thing you might have heard of is natural beers versus raw beers. So natural beer, it's kind of a weird gray area of how people define that. I suppose if all of your ingredients were organic or ordained organic through whatever certification system you want to use, you could call it a natural beer, but there's not really any kind of synthetic process in beer, at least not in the mainstream. Another interesting one, which is something that you won't really see anywhere, is a raw beer. So this is a beer that has not gone through the pasteurization process. This is a beer that was formed without boiling the wort that you produce from extracting the sugars from the different grains. Not very common, but it is supposed that this is probably the first type of beer that existed in days before people had, bronze pots and different things to boil their liquids, where they could make beer, but it was unpasteurized, no boiling process, raw, as they call it. The last one, and probably the second most frequent question, is, hey, will this cause me to go blind? No, it will not cause you to go blind. So that comes from back in the days when people were doing a lot of moonshining, during Prohibition, 20s and 30s, stuff like that, where people would be making their own liquor at their house. So through the distillation process, you produce two types of alcohol. It's methyl alcohol and ethyl alcohol, or ethanol and methanol. Ethanol is what's in basically every alcohol that you drink. So beer, liquor, whatever it may be. Methanol is a byproduct of the distillation process, but is the thing that causes you to go blind. It's poisonous. And when you are distilling, that is initially what you start producing as you go through that distillation process, is you produce methanol. It's very easy to avoid actually consuming that, because you can calculate very simply how much methanol you're going to be producing to ethanol and just dump out the first portion of the batch that you've distilled. So it's very easy to avoid, but some people, back in the day, very sloppy, or maybe didn't even know, or cross-contaminated. But another big cause of blindness which came from the distilling process was lead poisoning, as people were using pipes that weren't certified food grade, just kind of stuff that they found on the farm or whatever it may be that contained high amounts of lead. So there's no lead piping involved in brewing, so not a high likelihood. All right, so how do you get started? You're going to need to purchase some specialty equipment, find some kind of recipe that you like. You can make with your equipment is going to be the big thing. Depending on the type of equipment you have, you can make different recipes. You're going to need to purchase those ingredients, and then you're going to need to dedicate an entire day to brewing. So equipment, you're going to need a big old pot. So typically most Americans will have something around an 8-quart pot or 2 gallons. This will be insufficient for brewing. You're going to need probably an 8-gallon to 10-gallon pot would be ideal. Something like a crawfish boiling pot or something very large. You can usually get them at Walmart. They're pretty inexpensive. Next, you're going to need 2 buckets, one with a lid. You're going to want to also make sure that your buckets, if they're plastic, that they are food grade plastic. It's very easy to tell because it says right on the side, hey, do not put food in this, or that it doesn't contain BPA or whatever it is, and that it's safe for food. You can get those at Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, whatever. You're going to need a really cheap cooler. This is going to be used as your mash tun, where you actually take your grains and soak them in hot water in order to extract the sugars. You're going to need a piece of Tygon tubing, right around 6 feet. You're going to need some bottles or some way to store your beer, some caps for those bottles, and then a special tool which allows you to attach those caps. Some optional equipment that's good to have, a hydrometer. This will allow you to determine the specific gravity of your beer as you're brewing it. That way you can do some calculations based on and determine its expected alcohol content. Overall, not really useful, in my opinion. If you just follow the recipe or you have a good idea of what you want to do, this thing is not really going to tell you anything. If you follow a formulated process, you just really don't need it. And then you're going to need a giant metal spoon. That's really cool just to stir things. So picking a recipe. Essentially, all beers are divided into 2 different camps. You have ales and you have lagers. So lagers are beers that are formed with a bottom fermenting yeast, and ales are beers that are formed with a top fermenting yeast. In terms of home brewing, lagers are difficult to make and ales are relatively easy to make. The reason being is for lagers, you typically need some kind of temperature controlled environment in order to make the yeast grow properly. So this involves maintaining the temperature of your beer like right at between 40 and like 42 degrees, depending on the recipe and the type of yeast that you have. A little bit more difficult to do, as we'll talk about later. You can't just throw it in the refrigerator because those aren't actually, temperature is not regulated precise enough, and you may get uneven fermentation or bad fermentation or just none at all. Therefore, it's a lot easier to use a top fermenting yeast just because they're more adaptive to warmer climates. So it's something you could ferment in your closet or in your basement, or just somewhere where it's out of the way if you have a house that's around 60 to 80 degrees, depending on the season. So then you're going to want to purchase your ingredients. You'll need grains, and the type of grain that you use will depend on the recipe that you select. Usually you don't just use one grain. There'll be kind of a blend of different grains. You might even add things in there like oatmeal, corn, all kinds of various additives, whatever your recipe calls for, or whatever you decided to make your beer. Then you'll need to mill those grains. You can build a complex milling machine to do it at your house out of a power drill and some gears, but it's much easier to do it where you purchase your grains, because 90% of the time they'll have the ability to mill it there for you. And what that does is just breaks apart the grain. That way, when you soak it in water, it's easier for those enzymes to start breaking it down and for the sugars to start being released from the grain. Next, you're going to have hops. Typically, hops are sold either as whole hops, like in this picture, or ground up and dried out into these little pellets for ease of transport and ease of use. And then you're going to need to buy some yeast. You have two different types of yeast, liquid yeast and dry yeast. There's really not much difference between the two. The only difference being for dry yeast, you have to do what's called a starter, where essentially you make a very small batch of beer, add your dry yeast in. That way it starts, reproducing and growing before you actually put it into your beer. Just makes the process more efficient, and you get a much more even fermentation. And then water, if you are into that kind of thing. You can buy water from the store, or you can just use it right out of the sink. There's lots of people that will tell you like, oh, I only use water from like X location because of this pH, blah, 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 blah. Ultimately, for home brewing, it's the least of your worries. For some kind of large production facility, yes, it's probably good that they have water controls and pH controls and add different, mineral filters for those kinds of things. But for your concerns as a home brewer, the thing that you have to worry about the most is contamination. So the water is the least of your worries. And then it's time to brew. So once you start brewing, you'll very soon end up looking like this guy. The person who got me into brewing is Travis here, who's actually in this call. And as you can see, he used to be an outstanding citizen and, just a fine young man there. And he started brewing, and he became a bearded degenerate who works at a brewery. And it's all gone downhill from there. He's even a furry. Causal relationship? I don't know. You tell me. All right. Stage one, the mash. So what you're going to do when you actually start brewing is you're going to pour about 5 gallons of water into your big bucket and then start heating it up. And you want to get it to about 160 degrees. It kind of depends on what style of beer that you're making for the actual temperature that you'll bring it to. But then you'll add your grain to your cooler there and then dump in the hot water and stir it. Then shut the lid and let it sit for about an hour, maybe 2 hours, depending on the style of beer that you're making, the type of grain, and what the recipe calls for. Stage two, a little bit of a controversial stage. So there's two different schools of thought here. One is kind of the British style of making beer, and one is the American style. The American style, which I use, includes a process called the sparge, where you heat 5 gallons of water to about 180 degrees, and you drain that water on top of your grains, and then let it pour out. And what that does is it pretty much strips the grains of their remaining sugars and kind of washes them clean, allows you to collect all those sugars into your boil pot. The British don't use a sparge. Their method involves just adding enough water and grain in the first part, so in stage one, in the mash, in order to get enough sugars to make beer. As to why the Americans use a sparge system, it could just be that maybe we don't have as much grains and we kind of need to be more efficient from the early days of brewing, or maybe we just think it's better. Who really knows? But the idea is you want to not disturb the grain bed as you're pouring the water over it. So I like to use something like a piece of foil that kind of disperses the water. That way I'm not just pouring liquid straight into grains and getting them all stirred up, that is. All right, next you go into the boil. So you want to boil the water sugar mixture for about 1 hour. And that's really dependent on your style. So you might have seen like various types of IPAs. They have like a 60-minute IPA, 90-minute IPA, 120-minute IPA. That's referring to the boil time. So what you're doing in this stage is, one, that pasteurization that we talked about earlier. Two, you're kind of reducing the liquid volume. So you are concentrating the sugars a little bit higher. And you're also introducing your hops. So hops typically have a schedule to them. And there's 3 different hops that go into any given beer. We have our bittering hops, our flavoring hops, and our aroma hops. So our bittering hops are the ones that we throw in pretty much immediately. As soon as that liquid gets to a rolling boil, you dump those in order to get that bitter flavor in the beer. Our flavoring hops are the ones that go in about 20 minutes from the end of the boil. That'll give the what you can taste when you drink the beer. And then lastly, you add in your aroma hops, and that's about 5 minutes from the end of the boil, and that gives it the smell. So 3 distinct kind of hops there, and depending on the ones that you choose, you'll kind of get your different blends of beer, your different flavor, different scent, different taste.
What does it mean if a beer is dry hopped?
So a dry hopped, so you can still do all these 3 hop schedules, but when you go into your secondary fermentation stage, which we'll get to, you basically just put in more whole hops in the container. That way, as it's sitting there fermenting, it also has the hops in there with it, and it maybe absorbs some more of their oils as it sits there.
Thanks.
Stage 4, flame out and cooling. So flame out is when you end the boil, you turn off your stove or whatever it may be. And then the objective from here on out is to cool down that beer as rapidly as possible. Get it from its temperature that's at 212 degrees down to less than 80 degrees. That way you can safely add your yeast without killing all the yeast. If you were to dump it in just immediately, all your yeast would die. You'd get no fermentation. So this is kind of the tricky stage of the process because you want to cool it rapidly. That way you minimize the introduction of any kind of pathogens, just natural germs that are in the air. You minimize the time that it's exposed to those kind of things. So next, you'll take your bucket, and once you have it cooled to less than 80 degrees, you'll just dump it into the bucket in order to introduce a little bit of oxygen in there to start the fermentation process, and you'll add in your yeast. From there, you'll just want to seal it up and place it somewhere safe. Make sure that you have a vent path in the bucket. That way, as it ferments and produces CO2, you have somewhere for that to go. Otherwise, the lid of your bucket will very quickly explode after a day or two. And how you store it and where you store it depends on your style. You could just throw it in the closet like we talked about earlier. That picture on the right there, I have it in a refrigerator back when I lived in South Carolina, because South Carolina is hot as balls, and it will kill every kind of yeast if you just let it sit in a 90-degree house. Stage 6 is what we call the primary fermentation. So this is the bulk of your fermentation process where the majority of the alcohol is going to be produced. It's style dependent, typically about 2 weeks, could be much longer, 6 months, years, if you're making something crazy like a Russian Imperial Stout. But 2 weeks is about the nominal time frame for your primary fermentation. From there, we go into what's called the secondary fermentation, and where we transfer the beer from that one bucket into another bucket without transferring the yeast. So what that does is it makes the beer a little bit cleaner. You don't have that large yeast sediment, which will form either at the bottom or the top of the beer as it ferments. And it will be a time where you can add those hops for dry hopping. You can add coffee if that's your thing. I've done that a couple times, works pretty well. And overall, it just produces a cleaner fermentation as you give the beer more time to settle out. Here's a video on the right here, some siphoning action. Pretty cool. As you can see on the top of that bucket there was a whole bunch of crap. That's the leftover hops from the boil process that were transferred into the primary fermentation bucket. So in the meantime, since you're bored and you have nothing to do, you should make some beer labels. This is one of my favorite things just because I love digging around in Photoshop. My first beer, the Hefty Bavarian Maiden, some kind of German style beer. Moving on next to smoked wheat every day, wheat beer. And then Oh Baby, a triple, a Belgian triple style beer. And from there, it took on pretty much a very meme style, Sam's Pintail Summer Ale, Citra Nirvana IPA, Irish Black Rifle. It was a coffee stout, turned out pretty well. Serpos, Bandas las conozco. It means Serpos, I barely know her. It's a Mexican style lager. That one didn't really turn out so great. I think the corn that I used was no good. And then the last one I made before I sold all my equipment and left the industry was a Vermont coffee stout. Pretty good. So stage 8, once your beer has finished its secondary fermentation, you're ready for the bottling process. So what this involves is you add bottling sugar, which is typically dextrose, to a bucket. And then you do that same siphoning process to move your beer from your secondary fermentation bucket into another bucket. From there, you'll transfer from that bucket into each individual bottle, and then you'll cap into each individual bottle. So what's happening in this stage is you've given the yeast that has since gone stagnant as it's consumed all the sugar in the secondary fermentation container, a little bit more sugar. That way it starts a little bit more fermentation, raises the alcohol content very slightly, but also mainly produces CO2, which will be trapped in that bottle and actually carbonate beer. So this is in my opinion, a very shitty way to carbonate beer because one, it can be inconsistent bottle to bottle. Two, as a home brewer, it provides the most scenarios in which contamination can be introduced. Ideally, you clean all your bottles beforehand, you sanitize them, you run them through the dishwasher, super hot, but at some point you're gonna have to touch them. Even if you wash your hands, you clean, and you're super careful, there's just a chance that you cause some kind of contamination of your beer. There are some companies that actually do bottle condition. The one that I can think of off the top of my head is Duvel. All of their beers are bottle conditioned. But it's just one way to carbonate your beer. Or you could keg it, which is my preferred method. Basically, instead of racking it into individual bottles, you just throw it in a keg. You don't need any sugar. You pressurize the keg with some CO2, apply your ideal gas laws. There's a cool little chart that shows you, hey, what's your intended CO2 content? How long do you want it to take? And that'll tell you the pressure that you need to set it at. You can also calculate it pretty easily just using, math. And then you relieve that excess pressure, keep a little bit on to provide some motive force, and then drink it up. Super easy, only takes 2 days, very consistent, very easy to control. A lot less mess, a lot less of a pain. And then if you want to give someone a beer, you can just fill up a glass or fill up a container for them to take it away.
Growler,
sure. Yes, beer sensei. Anyway, so from here you can get into a lot of specialty equipment. That was just the basics of what you need. And the keg is kind of the next step. And then from there, you can go absolutely crazy. So I built a precision temperature regulated keezer, which is basically just a Home Depot chest freezer with a little microcontroller that turns it on and off based on its temperature. And it can regulate that temperature within 0.1 degrees. Works out pretty well as it's a pretty good place for kegs. Gives you very consistent temperature. That way, if you need to ferment something at a very specific temperature, it can do that. It also allows you to maintain your beer at the temperature that you prefer. So while in your refrigerator, you want things to be pretty cold, maybe around 40 degrees. Ideally, you want your beer to be a little bit warmer than that in most cases. So something like 48, 50 degrees, just depending on your preference and the style of beer that it is. So it can be very helpful for that as it's very precise. So maybe you're thinking, you know what, that's pretty cool, but that's not specialty enough for me. Well, that's cool. You can build an entire tiered brewing system, which contains its own burners and its own transfer system. So you can go from piece to piece without ever having to pour or pick up any kind of pot or move any kind of container. You can also design some specialty cooling coils. Maybe you don't live in a place with a bunch of snow where you can just go shove your beer out in the snow for a bit. You live in, Texas where it's 100 degrees most of the year, so you need to cool it. You can use some cooling coils in order to get that accomplished rapidly. Still not specialty enough? All right, what about some pH controls? And then why not build an entire system which has pumps and different regulatory mechanisms to precisely brew the same kind of beer every single time? So as you can see, it can very quickly become an escalating kind of hobby where you start out with a couple of buckets and a big old pot and some beer bottles you saved from your friends. And then eventually you have an entire basement full of shit and you can't move anywhere because that would mean completely redesigning your entire brewing setup. And you just don't want to do that. So you stay where you are for the rest of your life. All right, great. So should I get started? Absolutely not. You should not get started. So I'll kind of outline who would be an ideal candidate for this hobby. Chemists would be pretty good just because they understand the science behind what's happening. with the beer and can probably produce a superior product to someone like me who's just following a recipe. So this might be a good hobby for them to, you know, kind of use their knowledge in chemistry to produce something that's interesting. They might kind of enjoy the calculations behind it. People who enjoy journaling and logging, so some kind of very slow iterative process where, you know, you change like one thing and then like you make a note of it, and then, you know, 6 months later when you try it again, you change another thing and you make a note of it, and you kind of have this very slow iterative process where you like kind of write down everything that you changed and that you did in like a very scientific method kind of way. So if that's your thing, great. This is a hobby for you. This is something that you would enjoy. College students not old enough to purchase beer. So this is one that I strongly recommend this hobby for. There's nothing illegal about purchasing buckets and grain. So you can make all your own beer as much as you want if you are someone who is underage and you have an apartment with a bunch of buddies. So great hobby for those kind of guys who, you know, have a kegger coming up that weekend, but can't purchase a keg, so they're gonna make their own. Divorced dads. So, you know, if you have had you've had a breakup but you're trying to, you know, reconnect with your college age kids and you want to like, you know, have something to do and they come over for the weekend or whatever, this is a great hobby for you. You know, allows you to like always have something to talk about with them. Send them like a bottle of your latest beer or whatever it may be. Talk to them about labels and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure they would like that. And they'd be like, oh, my dad's like really hip and stuff. Like he makes beer. Like, oh, he's got something going for him. I'm not worried about him. So, you know, really great for divorced dads. People this hobby is bad for. Anyone living in apartments. So when you put that water into that mash tun with all that grain, it produces an extreme odor. It smells good, but your house will smell like a granary. And by extension, everyone's houses next to you will smell like a granary for up to 2 or 3 days. Some people may like it, some people may not. So really depends there. It's not recommended for people in apartments. Additionally, whenever you're fermenting the beer, it releases kind of a fruity, like banana odor in some cases, depending on what kind of style you're making. So that can very quickly fill up your entire apartment. And also, when you dump in those hops for the boil, it creates an extreme odor that is unavoidable and smells like the dankest weed. So your neighbors might not take too kindly. Those who enjoy having money. As I said before, this is one of those hobbies where it starts off simple, like, oh, wow, like I can make 5 gallons of beer for 25 bucks. That sounds like a great deal. Soon enough, you're shelling out, you know, 500 bucks every 3 months to upgrade your equipment. You know, you're buying a house. That way you can build a brewing setup. It just really gets out of hand very, very quickly. Quirky eccentrics. So pursuing a hobby like brewing will only exacerbate those negative qualities that kind of make them antisocial. So not recommended for those folks. And also bad for literally anyone else because they either won't take the time to do it right, won't really find it enjoyable, or will get bored very, very quickly, as most of the process with making beer is waiting around. You have one day of intensive work where 90% of that day is waiting around, and then just more waiting around after that. So yeah. Also, mead can be made in just about the same process as beer. You just dump a bunch of honey into a bucket full of water, boil it up to pasteurize it and reduce the water content, and then put it in a container and let it sit forever. Easy. So in conclusion, homebrewing is a waste of time and resources, and instead you should study the work of great thinkers. And I will take any questions or comments at this time.
I'm not sure about one of the guys you got on this slide.
Yeah, which one?
I'm not going to say, but one really seems to stand out in this this slide.
All right, so you're not a Rousseau fan. I get it.
Yeah, so my brother-in-law, I think, has made mead before, and one of the times he fucked up his like carbon dioxide release mechanism, and it exploded in the middle of the night in his kitchen.
Yep.
So I've got a question about brewing. I think it's Coors claims that they ice brew their beer. What does that mean?
I don't know. Travis, you got anything on that one? Travis is my beer sensei.
For what little it matters, I've been a professional brewer for 2 years, and it's not worth it. In terms of brewing with ice processes, what I'm thinking they mean is after the beer ferments, it is crashed, and then it's always cold. So through transfers, through packaging, through shipment to the trucks, where they toss it wherever gas station, it's always kept cold. The more often or the more times you heat up beer, the more times it does a temperature cycle, then it's going to produce more off flavors. Also, anything light struck, so clear bottles, brown bottles still, any sources of UV can cause basically, I forget the exact thing, but it's skunking.
Skunking.
Yeah, it's mercaptans, I think is the word.
Yeah.
So anyway, tangent, but yeah. Also, Patrick, I noticed you didn't mention extracts of any variety.
No, I didn't want to get into that.
Yeah, so that makes it easier. He cited a full day for brewing, but if I was quick about it and really lazy and wanted to spend a little bit more money, but in my day quicker, I could probably do an extract batch in 4 hours.
Yeah.
But then again, I also have $500+ of tech to do that with, so it is a whole.
Yeah, extract brewing is essentially where you, instead of using the grains to extract all the sugar, you kind of ship this big plastic bag full of syrup where they've already kind of extracted a sugary substance for you.
You can do dry malt extract too. So basically, you just boil water, kill the boil, toss in the extract, stir it up, bring it back to a boil an hour, cool it, you're done. Let it ferment.
Do you think there's any market for like Mio, but instead of making like lemonade or something like that, it's making beer?
So you just squirt it in like water and it makes beer?
Yeah. It's incredibly concentrated beer that you then put in water and it becomes regular beer.
I think, yeah. You know what would be good for that? You know those like make your own soda things?
Yeah, like a soda stream, but that for beer, because then it would carbonate it too.
Yeah, because I think that's the missing ingredient there is, yeah, you can make beer by doing that, but it wouldn't be carbonated. So if you have like those do-it-yourself soda makers, you could definitely sell like, little beer super.
I definitely like the Mio more because you can do the same thing you do with Mio where you just kind of squirt it into your mouth. If you really want like some beer, you can just squirt your Bureau or whatever right into your mouth and tasty. I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
So for those of us tempted by potentially homebrewing, what hobbies do you recommend in its place?
Well, I've already suggested studying the work of great thinkers, some of them, great Polish Americans. But other than that, I would recommend something where you're building, maybe like woodworking. I don't know. It's probably got the same level of escalating cost, but something where you can have a finished product that lasts more than a couple of weeks and that you're not having to force off on all your friends who don't really want it.
How do you like when someone's making like let's say a sour? What's the process for that?
So sour is a type of ale. The difference being it's a lambic fermentation. So you just have different yeast. One thing interesting I was going to mention about fruit flavoring, and it kind of relates to GMOs and like non-GMO products. So a lot of times, instead of adding actual fruit to beer or actual fruit flavors extracted from fruit to different products, whatever they may be, what they'll do is they'll genetically modify yeast in order to produce those flavors. They'll produce the flavors with the yeast, and then they'll remove the yeast. So after they remove the genetically modified yeast, you're left with just the natural flavors, and your product is then still certified non-GMO. So that's another way you can add flavoring to beer and to just other foods.
Another way to do sours is less real, but it's called kettle souring. So after you produce your wort and it goes into the kettle, you lower the temperature down to about 100 degrees, and then you pitch some lactic acid as well as lactobacillus bacteria in there. And those are the ones that produce the sour cultures anyway. It's one of the things. There's also Pediococcus and Brettanomyces, but I'm not going to talk about that. And then you let them sour for approximately 24 to 48 hours. They break down some of the sugars into various compounds. When we did it in the big system, I think there was some CO2 produced. So it's not really a fermentation process because it's aerobic, and the main point of it is to produce to lower the pH. So we started at a pH of after I soured it down with the lactic acid down to 4, and then the bugs brought it down to about 3.2, and that's where I decided to start the boil. That eliminates the ability for the rest of your hoses and your fermenters and whatever to get, or at least in the homebrew scale, to get infected. Infected vinyl lines are pretty common with homebrew stuff.
Yeah, and so when you have an infected beer or whatever, really there's only 2 outcomes for that. 1 or 3, I guess. 1, it just tastes bad and you're like, oh, gross. 2, when you open the cap, it explodes and just kind of like foams out, or maybe it just blows the cap off the beer straight off. And 3, as far as health effects, it'll probably just make you poop a lot. Just as there's just an inordinate amount of yeast and bacteria growing in there. I have not heard of anyone getting like seriously ill or dying from homebrewing beer.
I think most of the stuff that can grow in beer, even if you get it infected or whatever, it's not going to kill you. It's very
Presumably the good little bugs are out competing the bad ones.
that's the purpose of pitching yeast, but yeah.
Yeah, you've selected for the type of bacteria or the type of yeast you want to grow in there.
Sorry, Pat.
Very good. Cool.
Something else that I wanted to mention when we're talking